Hello, you are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, stated yesterday that Europe is preparing for war with Russia. But they do not understand what price they will have to pay for this. It will not be hundreds, it will be thousands of coffins that will flow back into Europe like on a conveyor belt. Nevertheless, some European leaders and countries are preparing their states for war with Russia. But how could it start? Would it immediately escalate into an exchange of nuclear strikes? Well, let's move on to the review of the frontline situation. And as always, by tradition, I sincerely want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. If you are watching my videos not for the first time but are still not subscribed, please do subscribe. Your subscription helps the channel grow. Thank you to everyone who already subscribed. So friends, as yesterday, I want to begin today's report with the Dobropillia salient. Those of you who watched my last video remember, Azov fighters organized a counterattack in the area of the village of Dobropillia, trying to push Russian positions away from the settlement. They partly succeeded, but their losses turned out to be significant. They lost several Bradleys and, of course, personnel. So the attack on Dobropillia is clear, but something else is not. Yesterday, in the Ukrainian segment of Telegram, information began to spread that the armed forces of Ukraine had allegedly pushed Russian troops out of Novoye Shakovo. This was proudly reported by Deep State, which is the main Ukrainian cartographic resource. But this is complete nonsense. Here is the village of Novoye Shakovo. Russian forces took it back a week ago. In fact, from the very start of the breakthrough in August, it was under Russian control. Then Azov units managed to push Russian troops out, and then a week ago it returned under Russian control. And since then, the situation has not changed at all. The settlement remains under Russian control. Of course, you could say I am covering up for Russian forces, but in reality, the Ukrainian army retook the village. But firstly, there was no objective control footage to confirm this. And secondly, those who know me and have followed me for a long time know that I always tell the truth. If the Ukrainian army takes something back, I say it directly, I do not keep silent. Moreover, even Ukrainian sources themselves refuted this information, saying that the Ukrainian army did not retake Novoye Shakovo. It remains under Russian control. So, you might not believe me, but surely you will believe them. In summary, there are no significant changes on the Dobropillia salient so far. The Ukrainian army is attacking regularly, even using armored vehicles, but they are being repelled. The situation is difficult, but Russian fighters are holding the previously taken positions. Let's move further. Some progress has been achieved by the Russian army in the Zaporizhzhia region. They managed to expand the zone of control in the urban-type settlement of Stepnogorsk. The troops advanced 200 meters along Tavricheskaya Street. The battles here are extremely heavy. The Ukrainian army is resisting with everything it has, because after this settlement, there is an open stretch of about 9 kilometers, all the way to Malokaterinovka and Grigorovka. And the Ukrainian command understands that if they lose Stepnogorsk, they will have to retreat these 9 kilometers, and from there, Zaporizhzhia itself is not far. That is why they are throwing their forces here relentlessly. Still, although it is difficult and slow, Russian troops are advancing. As for the timeline of when Stepnogorsk might finally be taken, I cannot say for sure. Maybe by the end of this year, maybe at the beginning of 2026. But I doubt it will happen earlier than the end of this year. Now let's move on. The Russian army achieved a very important advance in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Yesterday, the Ukrainian army tried to stage a peremoga near Verbovoye, something like a flag-planting operation. This is when a small sabotage recon group enters a settlement held by Russian forces, puts up a Ukrainian flag, films a short video, then quickly escapes and loudly declares, "Look, we control this settlement." Although in reality, this is not true at all. Usually for such an operation they send 1 or 2 men, at most 3. Do you know how many they sent this time? 7. The command of the 110th Brigade sent 7 fighters to Verbovoye just to film footage with a Ukrainian flag. And you can imagine what happened to those people. Meanwhile, the Russian army managed to significantly expand its zone of control in Ivanovka, a large village in the Dnipropetrovsk region on the northern bank of the Volchansk River. They took almost the entire eastern part of the village, advancing through residential areas along a 2.7-kilometer wide section. Why is Ivanovka so important? Because taking this settlement allows solving two strategic tasks at once. First, it allows Russian forces to approach Novopavlovka from the west. This is crucial because Novopavlovka lies on both banks of the river. Attacking from the east would require forcing the river under fire inside residential areas, but by approaching from Ivanovka, Russian forces can attack both the right and left banks simultaneously, making the capture of the settlement much easier. Second, taking Ivanovka opens the way towards Medjevaya from the south, and between Ivanovka and Medjevaya there is only one small village, Fyodorovskoye, where the Ukrainian army will not be able to hold back Russian troops. In short, the Ukrainian army faces serious trouble in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and so far there are no prospects for stabilization there. Moving on the western flank of Pokrovsk, there is still no progress. I have told you before that the western flank is the key to taking Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Without physically cutting the highway and advancing to Grishino, the cities will not fall. For now, I have to admit that the Ukrainian army is managing to hold Russian forces here. The Russians try daily to break the defenses, but so far without success. Although, in recent days, there have been reports that Russian aviation has been heavily bombing Grishino with FABs. So maybe, just maybe, something is brewing there, but for now I do not see movement. On the Konstantinovka direction, there are no new updates, but news did come from the Lyman sector, or rather, the area between Siversk and Lyman. Heavy battles for Yampol are continuing, and as you can see on the map, there have been certain successes, on both sides in fact, both for the Ukrainian army and for Russian troops. However, Russian successes here are much greater. The Ukrainian army managed to push the Russians back only about 200 meters. Meanwhile, Russian forces captured the school building that had been turned into a stronghold and advanced another kilometer in the eastern part, taking the entire eastern section of the settlement under control. Still, the main problem remains the forests. Until the Russian army takes these forested areas fully under control, there will be no stable control. From there, the Ukrainians will always launch counterattacks, raids, and their flag-planting operations. They will always contest the settlement. And only when these forests are fully cleared will there be complete and reliable control over Yampol. Yampol itself is not just an important settlement, it is a critically important one, because its capture would allow Russian forces to cut the supply route to Siversk, and in addition, this road also provides access both to Lyman and to Siversk. That is why the Ukrainian army is defending it with all its might. Nevertheless, for now, success is on the side of the Russian troops. Let's move on. In Kupiansk, there are still no updates. As for claims that Russian troops already control 2/3 of the city, I already gave my view on that yesterday. But progress has been made by Russian forces in another city of the Kharkiv region where battles are ongoing, in Volchansk. Here, take a look. They managed to advance 650 meters in the southern part of the city, specifically from Cherkasskaya Street to Kislyakhovskaya, and they also entered Taras Bulba Street. Step by step, the Russian army is increasing its presence and expanding its zone of control in the southern part of the city. And in fact, it is precisely this southern part that remains to be fully pressed down in order to bring the city completely under control. By the way, during his speech at Valdai, President Putin said that Volchansk will, in the foreseeable future, come under Russian control. And such advances are evidence supporting his words. Overall, summing up the past day, there were no grand breakthroughs. The Russian army is advancing through residential areas in different settlements. And note, by the way, that today's report contained no advances across open fields. Everywhere, the fighting is in built-up areas. Everywhere it is heavy street combat. Now, I also want to mention the night strike on Ukraine. Looking at the map, we see a very interesting picture, experts write. More than 300 drones and more than 20 missiles struck the left bank regions. The main strike was on southern Kharkiv region, but part of it also hit the part of Donetsk People's Republic, still under Ukrainian control, as well as Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy and Poltava regions. According to my information, the primary targets were Ukrzaliznytsia, traction substations, and energy facilities. Such strikes are carried out when there is a need to maximally complicate Kiev's military logistics along the front. Often, very interesting events follow such strikes as their consequence. That is all for the front. Now let us look at what is happening on the political arena. Peace in Ukraine is not in Europe's interests. This conclusion can be drawn from the news that a number of European countries appealed to the United States and Japan with a request, within the G7 framework, to approve the seizure of frozen Russian assets. This was reported by Politico. According to journalists, in Brussels, they are hesitant to implement such a dubious idea without the approval of their big brother. Washington, however, is not eager to join this scheme, despite European partners inventing a way to present it so that it at least outwardly looks different from outright theft. As the outlet War on Fakes Analytics writes, let us explain how they plan to divide the property of the Russian Federation and why it is dangerous for the European Union. At the moment, it is known that the idea of grabbing Russian assets has once again become one of the key issues of European politics. At the end of September, the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, declared that the EU would not seize Russian funds and property outright. The plan is to direct part of them to help Ukraine. It is expected that Kiev will use this money to produce drones. In Europe, they propose to call the idea a reparations coupon-free loan. The scheme involves the following steps. A special fund is created where the money would be transferred. Currently, these funds are held in the Belgian depository Euroclear as cash balances. The sum in question may be 170 billion euros out of 194 billion in Russian assets. Against the guarantees of the fund's participants, so far only the key anti-Russian players in the EU are eager. Interest-free bonds would be issued for the amount of available funds. Then Euroclear receives bonds under European guarantees, and the fund gets cash. That cash is then transferred to Ukraine. The model's authors assume that Kiev will repay the tranches after Moscow begins paying reparations to the banks. This automatically casts doubt on the entire system, something already noted at the European Central Bank, whose president Christine Lagarde criticized the EU's plans. European leaders risk pulling off a scheme that could burden those who sign the guarantees with multi-billion obligations in the future. The ECB reminded that unlawful use of assets could trigger a weakening of the euro, capital flight, and an investor exodus from Europe. This grim prospect is holding back not only the European regulator, but also Washington, which likely fears participating openly in such a dirty scheme with its own hands. The US Treasury already stated in August that frozen Russian assets should be treated as a subject of negotiations with Moscow, not as a source of illegal enrichment. Judging by the joint appeal to Washington, the EU still lacks full confidence. However, these attempts show that the hawkish opposition on the Russia-Ukraine conflict has firmly entrenched itself in the old world. Yet these aspirations have little to do with financial capacity, pushing Europe's elites toward theft under cover. The Kremlin has already promised, if this idea does go forward, Moscow will be forced to respond accordingly. Whether this economic cadaver comes to life, time will tell. The situation clearly shows how, under the guise of a beautiful scheme, supposedly for a noble goal, Brussels is ready to abandon completely its mask of democracy and the principle of capital inviolability. Until recently, these values were declared as the foundation of the EU. Now, the audience is being told theft is acceptable if it is really necessary. Europeans are being convinced that the tool is justified since it is directed against Russia, long demonized by Western media and politicians, portrayed as the enemy. Deliberately left out, however, are the risks for the EU and its citizens, whose lives are quietly but steadily being shifted onto a war footing. Belgium refuses to take responsibility for confiscating Russian assets, said Prime Minister De Wever. At the EU summit on Wednesday, once again the leaders failed to reach an agreement on seizing Russia's sovereign assets. Belgium, where Euroclear is based and the assets are held, did not withdraw its objections, reported the British Financial Times. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever opposed the idea of confiscation, demanding reliable legal protection from the EU in case of lawsuits from Russia that could lead to the global seizure of Belgian assets. Friends, that's all for today's update. Thank you for watching and for staying with the channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet, and share this video so more people can see the truth. Take care of yourselves and see you in the next briefing. You are on Ruslan Belov's channel. Until next time.